Welcome back to News at Prime. Let's give you some business news now. The South African Revenue Service says it was able to squeeze out sizable revenue despite a slow economy, low tax base and a freeze on fuel levies. SARS collected 1.7 trillion rand from the 2023-2024 financial year, a growth of around 3.2%. The revenue collector says personal income tax, VAT and corporate duties remain the largest sources of tax revenue in the country, making up around 80% of collections. Now, SARS says it paid out around 413 billion rand in refunds to taxpayers. But despite the great work, SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter says many potential taxpayers are still slipping through the net and not paying tax. He joins us now. Commissioner, thank you for chatting to us this evening. You went to Parliament today to present some of the great work you've done in terms of collecting revenues. In terms of that 1.7 trillion that is collected, did individual taxpayers come to the party?
So, thank you for the question. I think there's two important data points that I want to refer to as far as individuals coming to the party is concerned. So we find that when the individual's tax affairs are largely managed via the payroll, in other words, it's employer administered, you have a compliance level of around about the mid to late 70% compliance level. And for individuals who do not come by the payroll or who have more complex forms of income like investment income and other interest income and other forms of income, their matters are generally more compliant, and we actually find a lower level of compliance around about the late 50s percent of compliance. So we really have to thank the employers who work with us to improve payroll administered compliance. Of course, the numbers we shared this morning in Parliament related to the previous financial year, but we are continuing in this current financial year. We have just come to the end of the filing season for non-provisional taxpayers, and I can report a positive outcome that of the 8 million or so taxpayers who were required to file, that most of them have filed. There's about 800,000 non-provisional taxpayers who must still file. I would like to use the opportunity to say to those individuals, please file and contact us before we contact you, because it is actually a criminal offense not to submit your return. And then, of course, provisional taxpayers still have until January before they have to file.
That deadline, Commissioner, for income taxpayers closing yesterday, what are some of the repercussions for those who missed the deadline and didn't file their taxes?
Well, so we find, interestingly, a phenomena where people who expect a refund generally file early, and people who expect that they will have to pay in generally file late. So we suspect that those who have not yet filed also will owe SARS tax revenues. And therefore, they have now triggered an potential enforcement action by us. We will follow up taxpayers, the 800,000 I have referred to for the current year, leaving prior years aside. We will follow up these 800 taxpayers to ensure that they file. But already, as from midnight last night, the interest clock have started ticking. So there will be administration penalties that will be paid. But potentially, if these are habitual non-compliers, they may also find criminal sanctions.
Some people do get deviant and tax dodge. What are the penalties around this, and what can you do to try and recoup that money, in a forcible manner, if you will?
Look, I mean, so we don't use what you call forcible manner as our first. So our first engagement is generally a soft touch, where we would remind, make a friendly follow-up call, and encourage people to honor their obligation and to submit their returns. When we believe there is also financial implications, then also we have what we refer to as not an auto assessment. We make a decision about an assessment, and we can levy and raise the additional taxes, which means that those individuals immediately have a debt obligation towards SARS. And once you have a debt obligation towards SARS, SARS can either collect these debt via a bank. We can enter into a garnishee order with your employer, or appoint a bank as a third-party collection agency. And failing that, SARS will then increasingly become more assertive and can ultimately lead to attaching some of your assets to prevent a capital or a flight risk of the revenue that's due to us. But we don't start there. We start by reminding people of the obligations. We start by encouraging people to comply, and slowly we use more enforcement type legal provisions, because ultimately we have to protect the fiscus from revenue that's due to the fiscus. It's unfair that you and I, who honestly pay our taxes and fulfill our obligations, we do so, and those who willingly and wittingly break the law get away with it. That cannot happen.
Well, SARS was able to pay back some 400 billion rand to taxpayers. Has that left a little dent in your purse?
No, we accept that at the end of the year, there is a natural reconciliation. And SARS does not collect a cent more than what is due, in the same way that we cannot collect a cent less than what is due. So that final reconciliation is where we take all of the payments that we have received from a taxpayer, in this case through employers mostly, or from other means. In the case of provisional taxpayers, they pay the provisional payment directly to SARS. And then we will take the actual obligation and compare that with what taxes have already been paid, and there can be one of three outcomes. The first outcome, which is the best outcome, is to say to you that your obligations is completely complied with. There's nothing addition that we should deduct from you. A positive outcome for many taxpayers is there's a refund due and you have not been selected for verification. In most cases, those people will get their refund in under 72 hours. And I guess the most bad news outcome, or the most negative outcome for someone, is to say, by the way, you've already paid in 1,000 Rand of tax, but according to our calculation, you owe another 10 Rand. Please pay that. Or if you can't pay it, enter into an agreement with us to pay it over a period that that we approve.
Commissioner, you've also spoken about not being happy about those taxpayers that get through the cracks. I read a fascinating article on the Business Day today about the illegal fuel blending, black market. Have you made any further bust there? And what are the tax implications of making sure you shut down such operations?
It's beyond just the tax implications. Let me just quickly, for those listening, say there are three things that we have to guard against. Because the production levels of our local refineries have declined, there has been an increase in the importation of refined fuels into South Africa. That has also given rise to an increase in illicit fuels into South Africa, and typically these are operators who act as criminals, who deliberately break the law because they don't want to pay the duties on these fuels, and in some instances these fuels are in fact illegally produced. So that's the first phenomenon. The second phenomenon is that we have operators in South Africa who will take paraffin and diesel and blend it and sell it as diesel. And the reason they do this is there's a significant price arbitrage because diesel has a higher tax payable than paraffin, because paraffin is typically for household consumption, for heating, for cooking. By many of our underserved and underprivileged communities still use paraffin. So it's a reflection of our socioeconomic structure, whereas diesel has a high, and therefore paraffin is lower, whereas diesel has a higher tax rate because it's typically for industrial use. And also part of it is to just incentivize the use of diesel because of the environmental impact. So we work with the DME to ensure that operators are appropriately licensed. We often get tip-offs, as in the case of the matters that we reported today, where the regulator tips us and advises us there's been some suspicious activities. And in this case, we then have to firstly address the tax evasion, because this is a blatant example of tax evasion, because by blending it typically on a 30% blend, you sell it as diesel and therefore you can charge it as diesel, but you save the tax because you've not taxed it. You've only paid taxes on 70% of it. And so there's a huge arbitrage. The second issue that we want to caution those, ultimately the consumers, is quality and safety. Because when you blend fuels that have different combustion levels, the chemical composition changes, and that does damage. It's typical if you had to go and you have a diesel motor car and you go and put in petrol instead, you can actually damage the engine. The engines typically can tolerate maybe 10%, but the minute it goes higher, you actually cause damage. You have safety risks, you have additional costs of repairs. And then there's the huge environmental impact, because if an engine or machine has been designed to use diesel, you put in kerosene, you have a higher emission level. So it's a complex issue that doesn't just transgress tax laws, it transgresses environmental laws, it transgresses quality and safety laws. So it's a huge scourge, and we will work with the law enforcement agencies to make sure that those who operate will be brought to book. Thus far,
Commissioner,
we have detected 38
thank you so
entities.
much for your time. We unfortunately have run out of time. Thank you for giving us an update on the country's revenue issues.